Section 1. The weight of the question. There is a throne at the heart of a dying palace, on a planet that has become a world-sized cathedral, orbiting a star that humanity calls sacred. And seated upon that throne, wrapped in gold and shadow, connected to ancient machinery by 10,000 cables and tubes and mystic connections that no living mind fully understands anymore, is a figure that has not spoken a clear word in over 10,000 years. His body is a ruin. His flesh is the color of old wax. His eyes are open, but they look at something no one else in the room can see. The tech priests who maintain his life support move around him in silence, reciting prayers that are also maintenance rituals, performing rituals that are also engineering procedures, because nobody alive is fully sure where the science ends and the devotion begins. They feed him, in a sense, not with food, with souls. 1,000 psychers, every single day, walk or are carried into the chambers beneath the palace and give up everything they are, so that he might persist for one more rotation of this ancient world. And yet, despite all of that, despite the rotting body and the silent voice and the 10,000 years of immobility, despite the shattered palace and the fractured empire and the enemies at every gate, despite every argument that could be made for his irrelevance, his passing, his failure, the entire known galaxy organizes itself around this one being. Millions of ships navigate the stars by the light of his mind. Hundreds of billions of soldiers fight and die in his name. Gods older than human civilization fear him. Warp entities that exist as pure psychic force, beings who were ancient when the first human drew the first fire, refer to him by a name they say like a curse. They call him the anathema, the thing that should not exist, the contradiction, the enemy. So, before we ask just how powerful was the Emperor of Mankind, we need to agree on what we're even measuring. Because power in the Warhammer 40,000 universe does not work the way it does in stories where strength is a number on a stat block. Power in this universe is a question of scale across time, across dimension, across the boundary between the material and the immaterial, across tens of thousands of years of history that is part fact, part myth, and part deliberate obfuscation by people who had very specific reasons for wanting the truth buried. When people ask about the Emperor's power, they usually mean one of a few things. They mean his raw psychic output, the measurable force he can project through the warp. They mean his physical capabilities in direct combat, what he can do to an enemy standing in front of him. They mean his intellectual and strategic power, the mind that planned an empire before the empire existed, that ran calculations across centuries and still got surprised in the end. They mean his current state, the strange half-existence on the Golden Throne, and what he is still doing from there. And sometimes they mean his potential, the terrifying question of what he might become, what he is slowly becoming right now, 10,000 years into his vigil. We are going to cover all of it, every angle, every confirmed fact from the lore, every documented feat, every extrapolation that the source material gives us reason to make. And we are going to sit with the parts that are genuinely unknown, because the honest answer to the question of the Emperor's power includes a substantial amount of genuine mystery, and pretending otherwise would be doing you a disservice. What we can say with confidence, right now, before we go any further, is this. He is the most powerful human psyker who has ever lived or ever will live. He is one of the most powerful individual beings in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. He has performed feats that, in any other fictional universe, would mark him unambiguously as a god, and yet he is also demonstrably fallible, demonstrably limited, and demonstrably bound by costs and consequences that genuine omnipotence would simply not permit. He is something genuinely interesting, not a character who is powerful because the story says so, a character whose power is one of the most thoughtfully constructed and richly layered things in a universe full of thoughtful construction and rich layering. Understanding him properly changes how you see the entire setting. So, let us begin at the actual beginning, before the Golden Armor, before the Great Crusade, before even the very first recorded word of Imperial history. Let us begin in the mud, on a world that did not yet call itself Terra, in an age before even the memory of what was to come. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching this from, and what time it is where you are. I am always genuinely curious about that. And if this kind of deep dive lore content is your thing, subscribing means you never miss the next one. Now, back to the beginning. Section 2. Born of 1,000 Deaths. Origins in Prehistory. Somewhere in central Anatolia, in what we would now call modern Turkey, roughly 10,000 years before the Common Era, a child was born to a Neolithic farming family. His mother was ordinary. His father was ordinary. His brothers and sisters were ordinary. By all external appearances, there was nothing to mark this birth as different from any of the 10,000 other births happening across the ancient world in that same season, except that this child would never die. The story of how he came to exist at all begins much earlier than his birth, and it begins not with him, but with others. In the deep prehistoric past, long before recorded history, long before any of the civilizations we know about put chisel to stone, humanity had its first psykers. They were called shamans, and in the language of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, they were something genuinely significant. They were the first human beings capable of touching the warp, the psychic dimension that underlies physical reality, and surviving the contact. Not just surviving it, using it, drawing on it, guiding their communities through it. These shamans could do things that other humans could not. They could feel the movement of warp entities before those entities manifested. They could sense danger coming from beyond the horizon of normal perception. They could sometimes glimpse what was coming, not in the precise and analytical way that later psykers would develop, but in the blurred and symbolic language of dream and vision. They were the wise men and women at the edge of every campfire, the ones who knew things they should not have been able to know. And then the warp began to change. As humanity grew, as human civilization spread across the ancient world, as the sum of human emotion and human experience began to pour into the psychic dimension in ever-increasing quantities, the warp became more turbulent, more dangerous, more saturated with the kind of volatile psychic energy that feeds on feeling. The entities that dwelled in the warp grew stronger, more aggressive, more conscious. The old powers that would one day become the Chaos Gods were still forming, still coalescing from the raw stuff of human emotion and alien suffering, and the long, dark history of a violent galaxy. But they were already strong enough to notice the shamans, strong enough to start hunting them. The shamans began to die, not in battle, not from disease, but from the inside out, as warp entities found them and consumed them, tearing apart their souls as they tried to reincarnate. Because that was the thing about these first human psykers. They could reincarnate. When they died, their souls could survive the transition, could persist, could be reborn into new bodies and carry something of their accumulated wisdom and power with them. It was the great gift that separated them from ordinary humans in a psychic sense. And it was the thing the warp was now stealing from them, one by one. They knew what was happening, and they knew that eventually, all of them would be gone. That the warp would swallow every psyker humanity possessed, and that without any psychic guidance at all, the young species would walk blindly into whatever horrors were coming, with no warning and no defense. So, they did something extraordinary. They chose to die all at once. Thousands of them, gathered from every corner of the ancient world by means we do not fully understand, performing a ritual of deliberate self-sacrifice, pouring every last fragment of their accumulated power, their wisdom, their experience, their love for the species they had guided, into a single act of creation. Their souls, instead of dispersing into the warp to be hunted and consumed one at a time, merged together, became something unified, something singular, something that the warp could not simply eat, because it was too large, too coherent, too deliberately shaped. And that merged soul, that concentrated essence of every human psyker from the deep history of the species, was reborn in the womb of an ordinary Anatolian woman, as an ordinary-seeming child who would grow up to be anything but ordinary. He was born immortal, not in the way that words like immortal get thrown around carelessly in fiction. Genuinely, biologically, psychically immortal. He would not age in any meaningful sense. He could be wounded, deeply wounded, wounded in ways that would kill any other being 1,000 times over. But he could always come back. His body would regenerate, his soul would persist. The warp could not simply consume him the way it had consumed his predecessors, because he was too vast to swallow, too deeply anchored in both the material world and the psychic dimension simultaneously. As he grew, his abilities grew with him. He began to remember, not just his own childhood, but his past lives. All of them. Thousands of individual lifetimes, thousands of accumulated perspectives, thousands of different approaches to the same eternal problem of what it means to be human in a dangerous universe. He began to carry all of that experience simultaneously, the way you might carry a library inside your skull, except that every book in the library was also a living memory with emotional weight attached to it, and he began to walk through human history like a ghost. For approximately 38,000 years, he lived among humanity in secret, not always in the same body, though the concept gets complicated when we're talking about someone who can regenerate from almost any wound and whose baseline lifespan is measured in geological epochs rather than decades. He appeared in different places, under different names, wearing different faces, playing different roles. Sometimes he was a wandering sage who showed up in time to give a civilization the piece of knowledge it needed to survive the next century. Sometimes he was a general who won a crucial battle and then disappeared before anyone could write his name in their records. Sometimes he was a craftsman or a philosopher or a teacher, quietly nudging the trajectory of the species in directions he calculated were survivable. He was there, as best we can tell from the scattered and fragmentary lore, for the rise of Sumer, for the philosophical flowering of ancient Greece, for the great empires of the ancient world, for the dark age that followed the collapse of Rome, for the slow rebuilding that led eventually to the technological explosion of the modern era. He may have been there for moments we recognize, playing roles we have attributed to other names, doing what he did, which was watching and occasionally intervening, careful never to do too much, too visibly, too fast. Because that was the thing about this 38,000-year vigil. It was not patience for its own sake, it was patience with a purpose. He was waiting for the right moment, the moment when humanity would be strong enough, advanced enough, desperate enough to accept what was coming. The moment when he could step out of the shadows and do openly what he had been doing quietly for 40 millennia. He was also, during this time, developing his psychic abilities to a degree that no other being of his kind had ever achieved. Every year, every decade, every century of existence added something to the enormous reservoir of psychic potential he had been born with. He was learning to control it with greater and greater precision, learning what it could do in the physical world, learning how to see through the noise of the warp to the signal underneath, learning, very carefully, how to use it without drawing more attention from the warp entities who already feared him for reasons they perhaps could not fully articulate. He went by many names during these years. Ancient sources within the lore mention a name, Neoth, that may have been one of his earliest identities. He was known in various traditions as a wanderer, a teacher, a stranger who knew too much and stayed too briefly. Some lore hints that he may have been the figure behind certain historical legends, the wise stranger who appears in a time of need, the prophet who gives a warning and then vanishes before anyone can ask where he came from. None of these names would last. The only name that would endure was the one he eventually gave himself, or perhaps simply accepted, when the time for hiding finally ended. He was the Emperor, not a title given by others, a recognition of what he actually was. Section 3. The Age He Waited For. Emergence and Unification. The Age of Strife is not a pleasant chapter of human history, even by the standards of a universe that does not deal in pleasant chapters. By the late 29th millennium, the collapse of whatever interstellar civilization humanity had managed to build during the dark age of technology had left Terra, Earth itself, fractured into a patchwork of city-states, warlord territories, and techno-barbarian kingdoms that fought each other with the kind of weapons that leave craters where cities used to be. The warp storms that had made interstellar travel nearly impossible for thousands of years were beginning to subside. Not because anything had improved exactly, because the birth of something monstrous was drawing near. The formation of a new chaos god, the catastrophic psychic event that would tear a hole in the galaxy and birth Slaanesh into the warp, was building toward its terrible culmination. And as it did, the storms that had isolated human worlds from each other began to thin. The Emperor had been watching all of this. He had been watching it for a very long time, making calculations we cannot fully reconstruct, playing a game of probability and foresight that operates on a time scale no other being then alive could match. And he had decided. The moment had come. He stepped out of the shadows he had been living in for 38,000 years. He revealed himself, first in the form of a military commander with resources and abilities that no single warlord on Terra could match, and then in his true nature, as something that was clearly beyond any ordinary reckoning of what a human being could be. His forces at this point included not just ordinary soldiers. He had been preparing, in secret, for a very long time. His laboratories, hidden deep beneath what would eventually become the Imperial Palace, had been producing something extraordinary. The Thunder Warriors, genetically engineered soldiers, the product of experimental augmentation techniques that pushed far beyond anything any contemporary faction could replicate. They were bigger than normal humans, stronger, more resilient, capable of battlefield performances that seemed impossible to anyone not aware of the genetic engineering behind them. But they were also unstable. The techniques that created them were early, imperfect. The Thunder Warriors were built for conquest, not longevity. They would not age gracefully. They would not integrate into whatever civilization came after the wars were won. They were a tool for a specific purpose, and the Emperor knew this from the moment he made them. He led them personally. This is worth pausing on. In a universe where the most powerful beings often work through intermediaries, through agents and proxies, and carefully maintain distances from actual physical danger, the Emperor of Mankind during the Unification Wars was at the front, personally leading his forces into battle, fighting with weapons that have never been fully cataloged by lore, but whose effects were described by those who witnessed them as something between conventional warfare and reality being briefly revised. He moved through the techno-barbarian armies of old Earth like a force of weather, unstoppable not because he was invulnerable, but because the gap between what he could do and what anything standing against him could do was so large as to be effectively unbridgeable. The campaigns he fought during the Unification Wars read like a catalog of impossible situations resolved through a combination of overwhelming force, psychic ability, and a strategic genius that consistently outplanned opponents who thought they were operating at the same level of sophistication. Some of the factions he conquered were genuinely formidable. The Albion kingdoms, for instance, resisted with their own proto-technology and their own military traditions. The Emperor's forces fought them to a near standstill at points, grinding through defensive positions that were better prepared than he might have anticipated. But crucially, when the Emperor encountered resistance that couldn't simply be broken, he tried something else. He appealed personally to the people leading that resistance. He walked before the clan lords of Albia unarmed, wearing white and crimson, and he talked to them. He described his vision. He made an argument for why they should join, rather than continue dying in a war they could not ultimately win. This matters because one of the things that is sometimes lost in discussions of the Emperor's power is that the psychic and physical abilities are only part of the picture. The strategic intelligence and the sheer depth of planning behind every move he made were as significant as any display of raw force. He was building something. Every battle, every negotiated submission, every careful construction of alliances and compromises was a piece of a structure that extended far beyond the horizon of any immediate conflict. By 712 of the 30th millennium, Terra was unified. The last of the techno-barbarian kingdoms had either been conquered or had surrendered. The world that had been a violent patchwork of warring factions for thousands of years was, for the first time in recorded memory, under a single authority. But the Emperor was done with the Thunder Warriors now. And the Emperor's mercy, such as it was, did not extend to tools that had outlived their purpose when those tools were also potential threats to everything he was building. The Thunder Warriors were unstable. Their minds, as well as their bodies, were deteriorating from the imperfect processes that had created them. Some were beginning to turn violent in unpredictable ways. Some had already committed acts that could not be permitted to continue. He had them killed, some in staged final battles, some quietly by the custodes, his personal guard, some by other means. The historical record is uncomfortable about the details, and that discomfort is appropriate. The Emperor did what he calculated needed to be done, and he did it without the kind of sentimentality that would have kept dangerous, unstable beings alive, for reasons of emotion rather than strategy. He was already building what would replace them. Deep beneath the mountains, in laboratories more sophisticated and more secret than anything else on the planet, a new project was underway. The next generation. Not just soldiers this time, something larger, something that would carry not just his genetic material, but something of his actual essence. His sons. Section 4. The Architect of Godhood. science, genetics, and the Primarchs. If the Unification Wars showed the Emperor's power in the immediate physical sense, the creation of the Primarchs showed something more fundamental. It showed the depth of his intelligence, the breadth of his knowledge across disciplines that had not yet been invented when he was born, and his capacity for a kind of creation that borders on the genuinely divine, regardless of how you choose to use that word. The Primarchs were 20 beings. They were created, grown, shaped by the Emperor in gene laboratories beneath what would become the Imperial Palace. Each one was built from a template that started with the Emperor's own genetic material and was then modified to embody specific traits, specific strengths, specific aspects of what the Emperor was and what he wanted his military commanders to be. He was not simply copying himself. He was creating 20 different versions of excellence, each one specialized, each one optimized for a different kind of leadership and a different kind of warfare. The scale of this achievement is difficult to fully communicate. In the 41st millennium, with all of its advanced technology and all of its accumulated knowledge, nobody else in the Imperium is capable of replicating what the Emperor did in those laboratories. The gene seed technology that produces Space Marines is derived from the Primarchs, which is itself derived from the Emperor's original work. And even that derivative version, many steps removed from the original, produces beings that are genuinely superhuman by any measure. The Primarchs themselves were something so far beyond Space Marines that the comparison barely holds. And the Emperor created all of them from scratch. Each Primarch was designed to be a living demigod, not in the loose metaphorical sense, in the sense that they were physically beyond anything that natural selection could produce given any reasonable time frame. Larger than the largest Space Marines, stronger, faster, more resilient, more intelligent, possessed of a charisma so overwhelming that it functioned almost like a psychic ability, even in the Primarchs who had no formal psychic gift, a quality that made people want to follow them, to die for them, to build civilizations around the values they embodied. Several of the Primarchs were also powerful psychers in their own right. Magnus the Red, who would become both the greatest and the most tragic of the Emperor's sons in a psychic sense, was described as the second most powerful human psyker in history, second only to his father. Magnus could perceive the currents of the warp with a clarity that most psychers never achieved, could manipulate it with a precision that even experienced practitioners found awe-inspiring, and could do things that technically violated the understood rules of how psychic power was supposed to work. The fact that the Emperor could create something like Magnus as a byproduct of a project aimed at military commanders rather than psychic specialists says something about the depth of the original design. The creation of the Primarchs required knowledge that the Emperor had not simply figured out on his own. Lore, from sources including the Master of Mankind novel, indicates that he bargained for some of what he needed. There is a place called Malek, a world that contained a gate into the warp, a place where the physical universe and the psychic dimension pressed against each other in a way that made certain kinds of exchange possible. The Emperor went there. He made a deal with the powers that existed on the other side of that gate, gaining knowledge he needed to complete the Primarch project in exchange for something that the lore leaves deliberately unclear. He knew what he was doing. He was not naive about the nature of what he was dealing with. He accepted the cost because he had calculated that the project was necessary and that whatever he gave up was outweighed by what he would gain. This is a very Emperor way of approaching a problem, and it also reveals something important about his power. He was strong enough to negotiate with entities that would later try to destroy everything he built, strong enough that they found the exchange worth making rather than simply consuming him. Once the Primarchs were created, the Chaos Gods intervened. While still in their gestation capsules, the 20 gene sons of the Emperor were stolen, scattered across the galaxy by forces working through the warp. Each capsule breached reality somewhere on a human-inhabited world. Each Primarch grew up in a completely different environment, shaped by completely different circumstances, developing in ways that the Emperor had not planned for and could not fully control. He found them, eventually. One by one, across the length of the Great Crusade, he located his scattered sons and reunited them with their legions. Some reunions were straightforward, some were complicated. Ferrus Manus, the Primarch of the Iron Hands, dueled the Emperor upon their meeting, wanting to test whether this being claiming to be his father deserved allegiance. The Emperor won, quickly enough, apparently, to settle the question without further debate. The Primarchs were the Emperor's greatest individual creations. They were also his greatest vulnerability, though he did not understand the full extent of that vulnerability until too late. But the Primarchs were only one part of what the Emperor was building during this period. He also created the Space Marine Legions, 20 armies of genetically engineered warriors derived from the Primarch's gene seed, itself derived from the Emperor's original template. Each legion carried the genetic inheritance of its parent Primarch, and through that inheritance, something of the Emperor himself. Tens of thousands of post-human soldiers in each legion, armies capable of warfare on a scale and at a pace that conventional forces could not match. He built the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that would make reliable interstellar navigation possible across distances too large for any previous technology to bridge. The Astronomicon is powered by the Emperor's own psychic will, channeled through a massive apparatus on Terra, and sustained by the life force of thousands of specially selected psychers. The beam it projects extends 70,000 light-years across the galaxy. That is the physical scale of the Emperor's psychic reach, translated into navigation terms. It is not a metaphor. It is a measurable signal that covers most of the known galaxy, projected by the force of a single mind. He also designed and built the first astropaths, the soul-bound psychers who would serve as the communication network of the Imperium, able to transmit messages across interstellar distances through the warp. He performed the soul-binding ritual himself for the first generation, linking their psychic senses permanently to his own in a way that protected them from the worst predations of the warp, while also permanently altering them. It cost them their physical sight. It gave them something else in its place. All of this construction, all of this preparation, all of this laying of foundations. And then the Great Crusade began. Section 5. The Great Crusade. When he was at his peak, imagine a being who has spent 38,000 years waiting, planning, and preparing, who has spent additional centuries unifying a single planet and creating the tools for something larger, who is now, for the first time in all of that vast existence, stepping into the role he always knew he was born for. That was the Emperor at the start of the Great Crusade. He went out personally. He did not sit on a throne and issue orders through intermediaries. He led his forces from the front, traveling between war zones on his flagship, the Bucephalus, meeting his Primarchs in battle and in council, fighting alongside Space Marine legions when the occasion demanded, conducting the entire effort of reuniting humanity's scattered worlds through a combination of personal presence, extraordinary strategic planning, and the sheer weight of being the most impressive individual being in any room he entered on any world he walked. The feats attributed to him during this period are extraordinary by any measure. He fought in personal combat against Xenos threats that entire armies had failed to stop. He cleared paths through warp space that should have been impassable. He negotiated the submission of human worlds that had been independent for so long that no argument short of his personal presence could have convinced them that joining the Imperium was in their interest. In direct combat during the Great Crusade, the Emperor's performance was so overwhelming that the lore struggles to find adequate comparisons. He was not just stronger or faster than the beings he fought. He operated in a category so far above ordinary combat that the accounts sometimes read less like battle reports and more like descriptions of a natural phenomenon passing through a battlefield. Psyker enemies found their power turned against them, or simply neutralized. Physical threats found that their most powerful strikes did not stop him. He killed. He moved on. The battle continued behind him, his presence having already decided the outcome. He was also, and this is less often discussed, one of the most formidable technological intellects in the setting. His understanding of genetics, of psychic theory, of engineering, of medicine, of navigation, of military logistics, of political theory, of history, of the deep workings of the warp was not just encyclopedic, it was generative. He did not just know things. He could extrapolate from what he knew to create things that had never existed before. The Primarchs, the Space Marines, the Astronomicon, the soul-binding ritual, the Webway project. These were not things he found in a manual. They were things he invented. During this period, he was also fighting a war that most of his people did not know was happening. The Chaos Gods, who had always known about him and always feared him, were active opponents throughout the Great Crusade, working through proxies and cultists and warp-touched individuals to undermine, corrupt, and counter everything he was building. He called them the ruinous powers, and he had no illusions about what they were or what they wanted. He was the anathema, the one being whose existence most directly threatened their long-term plans. Every step forward the Great Crusade took was also a step forward in his longer war against the forces that wanted to drag humanity into the warp. The depth of this opposition and his awareness of it shaped many of his decisions in ways that seemed strange or cold or even cruel to those around him who could not see the full picture. The Council of Nicaea, for instance, where he restricted the use of psychic powers within the Space Marine legions, was not an arbitrary decision or a conservative reflex against things he didn't understand. It was a calculated response to an actual threat. He had watched psychers throughout human history, including some of his own primarchs, drift toward corruption without understanding what was happening to them or why. He knew the risk better than anyone alive. The restriction was his attempt to slow the infection before it became uncontrollable. It was also a decision that came with costs he accepted, closing off a powerful tool from his armies in exchange for a reduction in the risk of that tool being turned against him. Classic Emperor calculus. His relationship with the Chaos Gods during this period is described in the lore with a specific quality that is worth paying attention to. They do not simply dislike him. They are not indifferent to him as they are to most individual beings in the galaxy. They fear him in the way that something fears what can actually hurt it. He is referred to among demons and chaos-touched beings as the anathema because he genuinely represents the opposite of everything they are. He is order to their chaos. He is unity to their division. He is, perhaps most importantly, the living embodiment of humanity's psychic potential, organized and directed with a purpose, rather than spilling into the warp as raw emotion to feed them. He was, at the peak of the Great Crusade, winning, slowly, against opposition that most of his generals did not know existed, working on timescales that made decade-long campaigns look like individual moves in a longer game, but winning. And then he did something that would cost everything. He trusted Horus with the crusade. He went home. Section 6, The Webway Dream, his most ambitious power play. The decision to leave the Great Crusade in Horus's hands and return to Terra is one of the most argued-over choices in all of 40,000 lore. It looks, from the outside, like the Emperor's abandoning the field at the moment of greatest success. It looks like hubris, or complacency, or a catastrophic failure to understand the risks his absence would create. But the Emperor did not leave without a reason. He left for what he calculated was the most important project in the history of the species: the Webway. The Webway is an ancient network of tunnels through the warp, built by the Aeldari at the height of their civilization, connecting thousands of worlds through pathways that are shielded from the ordinary chaos of the Immaterium. Where normal warp travel requires a ship to be exposed to the full violence of the psychic dimension, traveling in the Webway means moving through protected corridors that the worst of the warp cannot easily penetrate. It is, in practical terms, the difference between sailing on the open ocean in a storm and traveling through a tunnel under the sea. The Emperor had found an entrance to the Webway beneath what would become the Imperial Palace on Terra, and he had recognized what this meant. If he could extend the Webway, could build new branches of it connecting all of humanity's worlds, could give every planet in the Imperium access to these protected pathways through the psychic dimension, then he could eliminate humanity's dependence on the warp for interstellar travel. Think about what that would mean. No more navigator families with their warp site monopoly. No more black ships harvesting psychers to sustain the infrastructure of the Imperium. No more warp storms cutting off entire sectors from communication and reinforcement. No more ships lost in the Immaterium, swallowed by predators or dragged off course by psychic currents. And far more significantly, no more avenue for the Chaos Gods to bleed power out of humanity's collective psychic resonance, because the psychic energy that currently bleeds into the warp, through every act of emotion and every moment of human experience, would no longer be feeding the entities that lived there. This was not just an infrastructure project. This was a plan to win the war against chaos on the most fundamental level possible. Not by fighting them in the warp, which was their home ground and their advantage, but by cutting off their food supply, by evolving humanity past the vulnerability that made chaos dangerous in the first place. He needed to be on the Golden Throne to do it. The throne, as it existed then, before it became a life support system, was a device that could create and maintain a portal into the Webway, but it required a psychic anchor of extraordinary power to function. It required him, sitting in it, projecting his will continuously into the construction of a new network that no being since the Eldari had attempted to build. He worked on this project in secret, in the dungeons of the Imperial Palace, attended by the custodian guard and a corps of specialists so highly clearanced that most of them had never heard of each other. He told no one outside that inner circle what he was doing. Not his Primarchs, not Malkador, his closest advisor, except in the most general terms. The navigators, who would be rendered obsolete if the project succeeded, were certainly not told. The political complications alone would have been catastrophic, and the project was working. Then Magnus the Red destroyed it. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns Legion, who had seen in a psychic vision the truth of what Horus was doing, and who was trying desperately to warn his father, used a forbidden ritual to project himself psychically through the warp to the Emperor's chambers in the Imperial Palace. His intention was good. His execution was catastrophic. The ritual punched through the psychic wards the Emperor had carefully constructed around the webway entrance. It tore holes in the protected tunnels. It let the warp in. Demons poured through the breach. Millions of people on Terra died in the initial chaos. The Webway project, years of work at a level of psychic complexity that no other being alive could have managed, was shattered in a single moment. The Emperor never got it back. From that moment forward, the Golden Throne was no longer a construction tool. It was a seal, the only thing standing between the demonic breach beneath the Imperial Palace and the surface of Terra, and it required him to sit in it, continuously, pouring his power into holding the breach closed, while simultaneously managing everything else he was trying to do. He was already on the throne, in that sense, before Horus ever struck him. He was already locked in, already bound to Terra, already spending power at a rate that would have been crippling for any lesser being, just to prevent the catastrophe that Magnus had inadvertently created. And it was while he was locked there, unable to leave, unable to speak openly about what was happening without creating the very political chaos that chaos would exploit, that the heresy unfolded. The scale of what was lost when the Webway project was destroyed is not just a tactical or strategic loss. It represents the burial of the Emperor's true long-term vision for what humanity was supposed to become. The grimdark future of the 41st millennium, the endless grinding war, the theocracy of fear and death, the desperate survival against impossible odds, all of it could have been avoided if that project had succeeded. The Emperor knew this. He said so, in the lore, in one of the few direct quotes attributed to him. He had foreseen the moment of Magnus's intrusion as the point at which the future he was trying to build became impossible. He did not say that with self-pity. He filed it away and kept working with what remained. Section 7, The Final Battle, Horus and the Terrible Cost. The siege of Terra lasted for months. The forces of Horus, 9 Space Marine legions corrupted by chaos and supplemented by every aligned traitor and warp-touched warrior who had answered the call, battered down the walls of the Imperial Palace piece by piece. The defenders, loyal legions, and army units, and custodians, and Sisters of Silence fought with a desperation born of understanding what it would mean if they failed. Horus had spent the years since his corruption gathering power in a way that made the question of how the Emperor could have lost their duel slightly less puzzling than it first appears. He had been given the power of the 4 Chaos Gods simultaneously, not the favor of one patron, as most corrupted champions receive, but a genuine pooling of all 4 major Chaos entities' investment in a single champion. By the time Horus stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, he was carrying psychic force that rivaled, at least temporarily, the Emperor himself. When Horus lowered the shields on his flagship, it was a deliberate challenge, a dare. Come fight me. Come here and end it, Father, if you can. And the Emperor came. What followed on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit is one of the most documented and most discussed moments in all of 40,000 lore, and the discussion has generated enormous amounts of debate about what the Emperor was actually doing, and why he ended up so badly hurt. The physical facts of the duel, as established by multiple sources, are stark. Horus burned the Emperor's face. He burst one of the Emperor's eyes. He tore the Emperor's arm from its socket. He broke the Emperor's spine over his knee. When Rogal Dorn and the custodians arrived on the Vengeful Spirit and found the Emperor, he was barely recognizable as living. How does the most powerful human psyker in history end up like this against a being who was, however corrupted, still fundamentally one of his creations? Several explanations have been offered in the lore, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is the one that the official sources emphasize most heavily. The Emperor was holding back. He did not want to kill Horus. He had spent the entire siege of Terra looking for any possibility that some fragment of his son remained beneath the corruption, any sliver of the being he had made and trusted that might still be reachable. He had foreseen multiple possible outcomes. He had seen, or thought he had seen, a vision in which Horus was redeemed, in which this confrontation ended with the War Master returning to himself. He was fighting with one hand, in a sense, trying to both defend himself and protect the possibility of not having to deliver a killing blow. The second explanation is more uncomfortable for those who prefer their emperor as an unambiguous hero. He may simply have miscalculated. He had overestimated how much of his son remained. He had looked at the same data about Horus that everyone else had looked at, including the clear evidence of total corruption, and he had arrived at a wrong conclusion because he wanted the conclusion to be wrong. He had gambled, and he had lost, and the losing had cost him almost everything. The third explanation involves the scale of power that Chaos had invested in Horus. 4 gods, simultaneously. The combined psychic weight of the 4 most powerful warp entities in the setting, focused through a single champion who had been one of the greatest warriors in the Imperium even before corruption amplified everything about him. The Emperor, powerful as he was fighting the channeled force of essentially every Chaos entity simultaneously. Not directly, not on their home ground, but through a proxy who could bring that force to bear in the material universe. At some point during the duel, the Emperor found his answer. There was nothing left of Horus to save. The Chaos gods had consumed him so completely that the being fighting on the vengeful spirit was Horus in body and memory only. What it actually was had no interest in redemption and never had. And then the Emperor let go of his restraint. What happened next was brief and total. The Emperor reached into Horus and destroyed him, not his body alone, his soul. He unmade whatever remained of the War Master in a way that left nothing for the Chaos gods to recollect, nothing to be recycled, no fragment that could be gathered up and preserved for future use. It was the most complete destruction possible. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the beloved son, the greatest of the Primarchs by nearly everyone's reckoning, was simply ended. And then the Emperor collapsed. His body had taken wounds that even his remarkable regenerative abilities could not address in the time frame available. The damage was too severe. The drain on his psychic reserves from holding the webway breach shut through the entire siege of Terra had been too enormous, and the final unleashing of everything he had held back against Horus had emptied whatever reserves he still had. Malcador, the Sigillite, the greatest psyker in the Imperium after the Emperor himself, had been sitting on the golden throne in the Emperor's absence during the final stages of the siege, holding the breach closed by himself. He died of it. The effort of maintaining what the Emperor maintained killed one of the most powerful humans alive in the time it took for the siege to end. The Emperor was placed on the golden throne. What was left of him? The tech priests and the Mechanicum, working with knowledge they half understood, rebuilt the throne into a life support system, capable of sustaining what remained of his physical form. His last words, before he fell silent for 10,000 years, were an instruction to his Primarchs. Keep fighting. The war continues. Be faithful, be strong, be vigilant. Then silence. Section 8. The Golden Throne, a God's Prison. The image of the Emperor on the Golden Throne is one of the most enduring in all of Warhammer 40,000. The withered body in the golden cage, the dead eyes that look at nothing and everything, the mechanical breathing of life support systems so old that the tech priests who maintain them have lost the ability to read half the original schematics. The 1,000 cables connecting his ruined flesh to the apparatus that serves as both prison and engine. But the Golden Throne is not just a life support machine. Understanding what it actually does is crucial to understanding what the Emperor is still doing, right now, in the current moment of the setting, 10,000 years into his vigil. The most visible function of the throne is the Astronomicon, the psychic navigational beacon that extends 70,000 light-years across the Milky Way, giving Imperial navigators a fixed point of reference to orient by during warp travel. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium as a functioning interstellar civilization does not exist. Ships traveling through the warp without a reference point are blind, stumbling through a dimension where direction and distance have no stable meaning, where time moves at variable rates, where the only certainties are hostile entities and the probability of not arriving at any planned destination. The Astronomicon is the Imperium's lighthouse, every ship that carries Imperial goods, every army that moves between systems, every communication relayed by astropath, every crusade fleet that fights the enemies of humanity at the edge of the galaxy. All of it depends, in a direct and non-negotiable way, on the Emperor's psychic will, projected from the Golden Throne, maintained without interruption, fed by a constant input of sacrificed psychic energy that is the most horrifying thing the Imperium routinely does. 1,000 psychers per day. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. Every single day for 10,000 years, the black ships of the Inquisition have been traveling the galaxy, collecting human psychers and bringing them to Terra. The vast majority of these individuals did not ask to be born psychers. They did not choose the gift that marked them for collection. They are gathered, transported, processed, and sacrificed on an industrial scale. Their souls are fed into the machinery of the throne, consumed to sustain the beacon of the Astronomicon and maintain whatever else the Emperor is doing inside that metal chamber. This has been happening continuously for 10,000 years. The math is not pleasant. The ethical implications are not comfortable. The Imperium is built, at its very foundation, on a consumption of human life so constant and so enormous that it makes the conventional brutality of its armies and its inquisitors look like footnotes. And yet the throne requires this. What the Emperor is doing from that chair is so vast, so complex, so demanding of continuous power input that the life force of 1,000 psychically gifted humans per day is simply what it costs to sustain it. The second major function of the throne is holding the webway breach closed. The hole that Magnus tore in the Emperor's careful wards, through which the warp poured and through which demons flooded toward Terra, is still there. It has never been repaired, only sealed. The Emperor is the seal. The moment his psychic pressure against that breach drops to nothing, the demons on the other side will pour through into the physical universe at the most symbolically and strategically significant point possible, directly beneath the throne of the Master of Mankind. Third, the throne connects the Emperor to the Immaterium in a way that allows him, even in his broken physical state, to continue fighting the Chaos Gods in the warp. This is less visible than the Astronomicon, but perhaps equally important. Every day the Emperor sits on the throne is another day of continuous, invisible, psychic warfare against entities who want to consume everything humanity has built. And fourth, this one is less certain, more speculative, but supported by enough lore hints to be worth discussing. He may be guiding his people in the quieter ways available to him. Through the Emperor's tarot, the psychically reactive divination system that certain psychers use to perceive his will, through dreams and visions given to selected individuals at moments of genuine significance, through the faith of billions of worshippers, which has had an effect on his presence in the warp that the Emperor himself would likely find complicated to accept. Because here is the irony at the heart of everything. The Emperor spent 38,000 years fighting against superstition and religion, fighting against the tendency of humans to project their need for divine guidance onto whatever was most powerful in their vicinity. He built the secular imperial truth to replace the chaos of religious belief with something grounded in reason and evidence. He genuinely believed that humanity worshipping him as a god was both untrue and dangerous, a confusion of what he actually was with something it was not. And then he was placed on the Golden Throne, unable to correct the misconception, while the ecclesiarchy built the largest organized religion in human history with him at its center. The accumulated faith of hundreds of billions of humans, poured continuously into the psychic dimension for 10,000 years, does something. It feeds something. The warp is shaped by the collective belief and emotion of conscious beings, and when that much human consciousness focuses on a single figure, it amplifies his presence in the Immaterium in ways that go beyond anything he could have generated through his own efforts alone. The Emperor may be stronger now than he was when he walked the galaxy in physical form, not because of anything he chose, but because of what was done in his name by the civilization he built. Section 9, Still Fighting, Post-Throne Feats and Signs of Awakening. The image of the Emperor as a passive figure, sustained on the throne, is deeply incomplete when you look at the evidence from the current timeline of the 40,000 setting. The clearest and most dramatic single demonstration of the Emperor's remaining power occurred during the events that led to the resurrection of Robout Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, and then during the Plague Wars that followed in the region of space called Ultramar. Guilliman had been in stasis for 10,000 years, preserved in a moment of near death inflicted by his brother Fulgrim. His awakening, triggered by a combination of ancient technology and the power of the Aeldari goddess Yvraine, was followed by a journey to Terra, where he stood before the Golden Throne and communicated with the Emperor directly. This was, according to the lore, the first time in 10,000 years that any living being had actually spoken with the Emperor. What Guilliman heard disturbed him deeply enough that he has been notably reluctant to discuss the details. He emerged from that conversation declaring himself Lord Commander of the Imperium, having apparently received whatever direction the Emperor could still provide. But what happened in the Plague Wars is the feat that really matters for understanding what the Emperor can still do. During a desperate battle on the world of Ajax, Guilliman fought his corrupted brother Mortarion, the demon Primarch of Nurgle, on ground that was partially within Nurgle's own realm. Mortarion had spent the entire campaign poisoning and corrupting the region of Ultramar, attempting to drag the heart of Guilliman's territory wholesale into the warp. On Ajax, he came close to killing Guilliman with a disease called the God Blight, literally a plague brewed in the cauldron of Nurgle itself with the specific purpose of killing a son of the Emperor. Guilliman died. For a moment, by any reasonable measure of the word, he was gone. And then something happened. The armor he wore, the armor of fate, rebuilt for him by the tech priest Belisarius Cawl using ancient specifications, began to hum. Its power systems restarted spontaneously, the corruption eating through it reversed, the metal remaking itself. The disease blackening Guilliman's flesh burned away. He was healed. Not slowly, not gradually, but completely, in an instant, by something that every witness present recognized was not Guilliman's own doing. He opened his eyes glowing with white light. Not his own, borrowed. He spoke, in a voice that was not quite his own, a warning directed at the chaos god Nurgle itself. The message resonated through the warp so powerfully that thousands of sorcerers across the galaxy simultaneously wept blood from their eyes. Mortarion, one of the most powerful demon entities in the setting, was violently banished, yanked back to the warp without being able to finish the killing blow he had already raised. And Guilliman, carrying the borrowed power of his father like a weapon, burned a section of the Garden of Nurgle, the Chaos God's own realm in the Immaterium, leaving a wound in the oldest and most firmly established of the divine territories of chaos. The Emperor, sitting on his throne on Terra, hundreds or thousands of light years away, reached through the warp and through his son's dying body, healed one of the greatest warriors in the galaxy, delivered a message to a chaos god, banished a demon Primarch, and scorched divine territory in the realm of chaos, while simultaneously maintaining the Astronomicon, while simultaneously holding the webway breach closed. The Quora analysis of this feat frames it well. While holding two galaxy-scale responsibilities without pause, the Emperor still had enough power left over to perform miracles in someone else's war on a different plane of existence. This is not a being who is simply keeping the lights on. This is a being who is doing something we do not have adequate language to describe, from a chair he cannot leave, in a body that has not moved under its own power for 10,000 years. And there are other signs. In the lore of the current era, chaos entities and demon primarchs have begun discussing the Emperor in terms that suggest they are afraid of something changing. Kugoth, a greater demon of Nurgle, discussing events with Mortarion in the Plague Wars novels, speaks of the Emperor as if something has shifted, as if the being on the throne is more active than he was a century ago or a millennium ago, as if the long silence is not permanent. This fear from the entities who oppose him is arguably the most reliable indicator of what the Emperor is actually doing. They would not fear him if he were simply dying slowly. They fear what he is becoming. Section 10. The Anathema. Why Chaos Fears Him. The name the Chaos Gods gave the Emperor before he even emerged from hiding is not an insult. It is a statement of fact from beings who have existed since before humanity built its first city. It is a description of what he represents to everything they are, the anathema, the thing that is fundamentally incompatible with our existence. Understanding why requires understanding what chaos actually is, at the most basic level, in this setting. The Chaos Gods are not external invaders who arrive to attack a neutral universe. They are emergent phenomena. They grew from the accumulated psychic residue of conscious experience in the warp, from emotion and desire and suffering and joy, from every feeling that every thinking being in the galaxy has ever had. They are, in a very literal sense, made of consciousness, made of the interior life of the species they now threaten. They need that continuous input to remain powerful. They feed on worship and on emotion and on the psychic resonance that living beings project into the warp by the simple act of feeling things. Without that input, they would diminish. Not disappear, perhaps, because their cores are ancient and established. But they would be weaker, smaller, less capable of manifesting in the physical universe. The Emperor's long-term plan, the one that the Webway project was a major component of, was designed to cut off that input, to evolve humanity past the vulnerability, to guide the species into a relationship with its own psychic potential that did not feed the Chaos Gods, to make humanity, eventually, something that the ruinous powers could not consume. This is not something that Chaos can simply ignore or wait out. The Emperor is an existential threat not because he can beat any individual Chaos God in a fight, though the lore suggests the answer to that question is probably yes in the right circumstances, but because if his plan ever fully succeeded, the Chaos Gods would face a universe in which their primary food source had learned to stop feeding them. They also fear him for something else. He is the most powerful single psychic presence that a mortal species has produced, in a universe where psychic presence determines power and influence in the warp. He is the living proof that humanity's psychic evolution can produce something that rivals the ancient entities who have dominated the immaterium for millions of years. If the Emperor is possible, if one human being, even one as unusual as him, could reach this level, then what does that say about what the species as a whole might eventually become? The Chaos Gods look at the Emperor, and they see the future they have been trying to prevent. They see the answer to the question of what a genuinely enlightened humanity, guided by an entity with 40 millennia of experience and a sincere investment in the species' survival, might eventually evolve into. They hate him for what he is. They fear him for what he represents. Their earliest name for him, the Anathema, predates the Imperium. It predates the Great Crusade. It predates the Unification Wars. They called him the Anathema from the very first moment they became conscious enough to notice him, in the deep prehistoric past when he was simply a child with extraordinary potential, walking through an ancient settlement. They knew then what he was, even before he did. He spent 38,000 years being careful not to challenge them directly, not because he could not, but because direct confrontation in the warp, which is their home, is never the optimal approach when you can spend those 38,000 years working towards something that changes the underlying conditions instead. In the current timeline, with the Emperor still on the throne and the warp more turbulent than it has been since the birth of Slaanesh, with the Great Rift having torn the galaxy in two, there is an argument to be made that the Chaos Gods are actually closer to winning than they have ever been. The daemonic incursions are more frequent. The stable regions of the Imperium are more fragile. The light of the Astronomicon is harder to see from the half of the galaxy cut off by the rift. But there is also an argument that the Emperor is more active now than he has been at any point in the last 10,000 years. That the stirring described by chaos entities, the fear in the voices of greater demons discussing what they sense from the direction of Terra, the miracles that have become more frequent rather than less, all of it points to a being who is not diminishing, but building towards something. What that something is, nobody in the setting knows for certain. Several characters have dedicated their lives to figuring it out, and most of them have arrived at conclusions that are disturbing in their implications, though which way the disturbance cuts depends entirely on which faction you're asking. Section 11, God or Man? The question that defines 40,000. There is a question at the heart of Warhammer 40,000 that the setting has never answered directly and probably never will, because the uncertainty is too central to what makes the setting work. And it is this: is the Emperor actually a god? Not in the loose metaphorical sense, not in the limited sense of being very powerful and long-lived and influential, in the specific technical sense that the word God means within this fictional universe, where gods are defined by their relationship to the warp and their ability to shape reality through psychic force and the worship of their believers. By that definition, is the Emperor a god? His own position on this question, at least as he expressed it during the Great Crusade, was an emphatic no. He was a man, not a god, an extraordinary man, an immortal man, a man with capabilities that far exceeded anything any other human being had ever demonstrated. But a man, made of biology and psychic potential, not of the abstract stuff of the warp the way the Chaos Gods were made. He actively opposed the development of his own cult. He built the Imperial Truth specifically to give his people a framework that did not include worshipping him. He was, by his own assessment and by the assessment of his closest associates, a being who was on the same spectrum as other human psychers, an outlier so extreme as to be effectively in a different category, but still on the same spectrum, still constrained by physical laws, still able to be hurt, still requiring effort and cost to achieve what he achieved. But 10,000 years of other people's faith has complicated this picture in ways that even the Emperor could not have anticipated. The warp responds to belief. This is not a metaphor or a religious claim within the 40,000 universe. It is a documented physical property of the immaterium. When enough conscious beings believe something intensely enough, it shapes the warp. The Chaos Gods themselves are the product of accumulated emotion and belief. The Emperor's own soul, from the moment he was born, was shaped by the deliberate faith sacrifice of thousands of psychers who poured their belief and their essence into creating him. He began as, in some sense, the product of collective belief. And then the ecclesiarchy spent 10,000 years building one of the most powerful organized religions in the history of any fictional universe around him. Hundreds of billions of humans, worshipping him daily, pouring their faith into the warp in his name, without him being able to stop them or redirect them. The Chaos Gods are made of what the living believe and feel. By that logic, what has 10,000 years of the largest religion in human history done to the Emperor's presence in the warp? The lore suggests the answer is significantly amplified it. The Emperor's soul in the immaterium has become something much larger and more complex than the individual being who walked into the unification wars in golden armor. The faith of billions has shaped something in the psychic dimension that is, functionally, beginning to look like what the Imperium has always claimed it was. A god of humanity. Not the same kind of god as the Chaos Gods, who are defined by excess and extremity. Something more considered, more purposeful. A psychic presence in the warp that represents the opposite of what the ruinous powers represent, that grows stronger as humanity's faith and hope grow stronger, that is building slowly towards something that may eventually be capable of confronting the entities that have shaped the galaxy for millions of years on their own ground and winning. The Terminus Decree adds another layer to this. Before the current age, the Emperor gave the Grey Knights a standing order. If he ever returns in a corrupted form, they are to destroy him. He is not above suspicion. He knows his own corruption is possible. He knows that the forces arrayed against him have been patient and clever for tens of thousands of years. He knows that a corrupted emperor would be the single most catastrophic event possible for humanity, more dangerous than any external threat. The decree is an act of humility from the most powerful being in the setting, an acknowledgement that he is not infallible, that power without accountability is dangerous, that even the best intentions and the most extraordinary capabilities do not make any individual beyond the reach of corruption. Whether he is a god depends on how you define the word. By the functional definition most relevant to this universe, he is becoming one, if he is not already one. By his own definition, which he would still insist on if he could speak, he is a man doing an impossible job in the only way anyone could, which is by refusing to stop. The most interesting answer to the question might be that it does not matter. What he is, functionally, in the setting, is the pillar holding everything up, the light that every navigator depends on, the force that holds the worst of the warp at bay, the slowly awakening presence that demons fear and loyal servants pray to, and enemies plan against. Whether the word we attach to that is God or man, or something new that has no word yet, is a secondary concern to what it does, which is keep humanity alive in a universe that is trying very hard to kill it. Section 12. The feats ranked. Understanding the scale. Let us take stock of what we know. Let us look at the actual evidence, assembled and placed in order so the picture is complete. He was born as the reincarnation of thousands of the most powerful human psychers in prehistoric history, carrying their accumulated power and wisdom from the moment of his first breath. He lived for 38,000 years in secret, accumulating psychic ability and developing mastery over it that no other being in the setting has ever matched. He created the Astronomicon, a psychic beacon that covers 70,000 light-years, powered by his own will and sustained continuously for tens of thousands of years. He created the 20 Primarchs, using his own genetic material and psychic essence, building beings so far beyond human that they are treated as living demigods by the civilizations they interact with. He created, from those Primarchs' templates, 20 Space Marine legions, each tens of thousands of warriors strong, each carrying a psychic inheritance that connects them to him across any distance. He performed the soul-binding ritual for the first generation of astropaths, a procedure that requires extraordinary psychic precision and that permanently links their senses to his. He led the Great Crusade personally, fighting at the front of battles across hundreds of worlds, winning conflicts against enemies that entire armies could not handle. He designed and began construction of the greatest infrastructure project in human history, the expansion of the webway, which would have eliminated humanity's dependency on the warp entirely. When Horus, empowered by 4 chaos gods simultaneously, fought him on the vengeful spirit, the Emperor ultimately destroyed him so completely that even the chaos gods could not retrieve his soul. Sitting on the golden throne for 10,000 years, he has simultaneously maintained the Astronomicon, held the webway breach closed, fought chaos entities in the warp, guided select individuals through visions and the Emperor's tarot, and soul-bound psychers. He reached across interstellar distances during the Plague Wars to resurrect Guilliman, deliver a warning that made a chaos god flinch, banish a demon Primarch with a psychic gesture, and burn a wound into the Garden of Nurgle, the most established divine territory in the Chaos realms. And through all of this, while doing all of this, he has been feeding on 1,000 souls per day just to maintain the minimum necessary operations. Imagine what he could do if the throne were repaired, if the webway breach were sealed by other means, if he were freed from the twin burdens he has carried since the end of the heresy. Some characters in the lore have imagined exactly this, and the conclusion they arrive at, the enemies he would be able to face with everything freed, is something that even the Chaos Gods appear to be actively trying to prevent from happening. The scale of his power, when you lay it all out, is not primarily about what he can do to a single enemy in a single fight. It is about what one being can sustain, continuously, against forces operating on galactic and transdimensional scales, across a time span measured not in years but in 10 millennia. That kind of sustained output, maintained without rest or relief, is itself a form of power that has no adequate comparison within the setting. Section 13. What he was building. The larger vision. The Emperor is often discussed in terms of what he was fighting against. The Xenos threats, the Chaos Gods, the corruption of his own sons, the entropy of the warp, and all of that is accurate and important, but it misses something. He was also building towards something. He always was. Every choice he made, including the choices that seem most cold and most calculating and most willing to accept terrible costs, was oriented toward a specific future he was trying to create. He wanted humanity to evolve, not in the vague sense of getting better as a species through accumulated experience. He meant psychic evolution, in the specific sense relevant to this universe. He knew that humanity was in the middle of a transition from a primarily physical species to a primarily psychic one, that the psychers appearing in increasing numbers across the human population were the early signs of something that would eventually encompass the entire species. He wanted to guide that transition, to shepherd it, to make sure that when humanity emerged on the other side of the evolutionary process, it emerged as something that could navigate the universe with genuine capability rather than stumbling into chaos-driven catastrophe. His model for what a psychically evolved humanity might look like was, in a sense, him. Not in the sense of wanting 10 billion copies of himself, in the sense of wanting a species that could touch the warp without being consumed by it, that could use psychic ability without being corrupted by it, that could navigate the immaterium without feeding the entities that lived there. A species that had learned to be what he already was. This is why the Webway project mattered so much. It was not just infrastructure, it was the framework within which that evolution could happen safely. If humanity no longer needed to expose itself to the warp for travel and communication, then the most dangerous window for corruption was closed. The The species could develop at its own pace, in relative safety, with him watching and guiding and preventing the worst of the mistakes along the way. That future was taken from him. The Horus Heresy was not just a military defeat or a personal betrayal, though it was both of those things. It was the destruction of the most important plan he had ever made. And yet, he persists. He continues. He does not give up. He carries the twin burdens he was left with when the plan was destroyed, and he finds new ways to work toward the same destination from a position of catastrophic disadvantage. The miracles, the guidance through the tarot, the subtle interventions visible only in hindsight. These are not the actions of a being who has accepted defeat. They are the actions of a being who is playing a much longer game than anyone else in the setting. The grimdark future of the 41st millennium is not, in this reading, the Emperor's failure. It is an obstacle he is still working to overcome from the most constrained possible position, using tools that none of his advisors or enemies fully understand. There is something almost unbearably determined about that. Section 14. Comparisons. How does he stack up? In a setting full of extraordinary beings, where does the Emperor actually sit? Against other psychers, the answer is unambiguous. He is the most powerful human psyker in history, and almost certainly the most powerful human psyker that will ever exist, given that his origin as the reincarnation of thousands of prehistoric shamans is not something that is likely to be replicated. Magnus the Red, widely considered the second most powerful human psyker ever, is not in the same tier. The gap between them is described in the lore in terms that suggest comparison is almost meaningless. Magnus is extraordinary by any measure. He is not the Emperor. Against the Primarchs in direct combat, the evidence from the Great Crusade suggests the Emperor was simply in a different category. Ferrus Manus, one of the physically strongest Primarchs, challenged him to a duel and lost quickly enough that the result was not in question. This was not Ferrus at his best, perhaps, but it was still a Primarch in his prime testing himself against his father, and the outcome was decisive. Against Horus, empowered by 4 Chaos Gods, the fight was brutal and nearly fatal, and the Emperor carried terrible wounds into a victory that left him unable to function independently. But he won. Against the most empowered champion the Chaos Gods have ever created in the material universe, he survived and destroyed the enemy completely. That has to count for something significant. Against the Chaos Gods themselves in the warp, the comparison is genuinely difficult. In the material universe, the evidence strongly suggests he could match or exceed any single Chaos God's channeled power through a mortal champion. In the warp, on their home ground, where they are native and he is not, the balance shifts. The answer probably depends on how much power he can bring to bear versus how much each individual god can marshal, and on the fact that fighting in the warp at full strength is simply not something he has done in any documented encounter. Against the full combined power of all 4 Chaos Gods simultaneously, the lore is less clear. Some sources suggest he could, at his peak, have matched them even collectively. Others suggest that Horus, as their combined champion, was enough to nearly kill him. The truth probably involves nuances about what his full power, unrestrained, actually looks like, and that is something the setting has never shown directly. Against Xenos entities of similar tier, the ancient Aeldari who built the webway clearly recognized him as something exceptional. The Necrons, who exist in a very different relationship to the warp, present a different kind of threat that his psychic power is less directly relevant to. The Tyranids, entities that are genuinely existentially dangerous to the Imperium, were reportedly drawn to the galaxy in part by the signal of the Astronomicon, which means the Emperor's greatest achievement in terms of infrastructure may also have attracted one of the gravest threats his species faces. Whether this counts as a failure or simply as an unavoidable consequence of operating on galactic scales in a universe full of predators is a question the setting does not definitively answer. Section 15. The Light That Will Not Die. There is a line in the opening description of the Warhammer 40,000 universe that has appeared in various forms across decades of publications. You will know it if you have been in this hobby for any length of time. It describes the Emperor as a rotting carcass writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology, the carrion lord of the Imperium, for whom 1,000 souls are sacrificed every day so that he may never truly die. The grimdark reading of that description is the obvious one. The horror of it, the waste, the empire built on suffering, the god who is not quite alive and not quite dead, the endless machine of sacrifice and faith grinding forward on the fuel of human lives. But there is another reading, not a comfortable one, not a reading that makes the cost any less real or the sacrifice any less terrible, but a reading that takes seriously the word that the description uses: never truly die, not yet dead, not completed, not finished, something that persists through conditions that should have ended it long ago by sheer force of will, in the service of a purpose that has not yet been fulfilled. He made the shamans a promise, in a sense, when they poured their combined essence into his creation. Not a spoken promise, not a formal contract, but the implicit promise of the act itself. They died to create something that would survive where they could not. That would continue what they had tried to do. That would stand between the species and the warp things that had been consuming their kind one by one. He has not broken that promise. That is the simplest and most honest measure of his power in the end. Not the raw psychic output, not the feats in battle, not the architecture of the Imperium, or the genius of the Primarch Project, or the elegance of the Webway plan. The measure of his power is that he is still there, still doing the job, still holding the worst of it back, from a chair in a broken palace, on a world that has turned his name into a religion he would despise, surrounded by people who worship him without understanding what he actually is. And according to the most recent chapters of the Story Games Workshop is telling, he is stirring. Something is changing in the calculus of his long game. The enemies who feared him most are beginning to fear him again in new ways. The Chaos Gods are paying attention to Terra in ways that suggest they believe something is coming, something they have been trying to prevent for 10,000 years. Whether the Emperor ever rises from that throne, whether the Imperium finds a way to repair the Golden Throne and release the being inside it, whether the ending of this long vigil is liberation or catastrophe or something too complex to be described as either, none of us know yet. The story is still being written, but the question of how powerful he was, how powerful he is, and how powerful he might yet become has, I hope, an answer now that is richer and more nuanced and more genuinely interesting than simply picking a number and pointing at it. He is the product of humanity's entire psychic history, concentrated into a single point. He is the thing the warp has feared since before it knew what it was afraid of. He is 38,000 years of waiting, transformed into 38,000 years of never stopping. He is a dying body and an undying will, separated from each other by 10 millennia and still, somehow, moving in the same direction. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But at the heart of that darkness, there is a light that, 10,000 years in, is still on. And no one in the galaxy, friend or enemy, is quite sure what happens when it finally decides to burn at full strength again. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you spending time with it. This is the kind of deep lore content I love making, so if you want to see more, hitting subscribe means you will be there when the next one lands. Drop a comment below, letting me know what aspect of the Emperor's story you found most interesting, whether that is the prehistoric origins, the feats on the throne, or the question of what happens if he ever wakes up fully. Every comment helps this content reach people who would want to find it, and it lets me know what you want to see explored next. Until then, the Emperor protects. End of script. Extended section, the mind behind the throne, intelligence as power. It would be easy, listening to everything covered so far, to think of the Emperor primarily in terms of what he could do in a direct fight. The psychic output, the physical force, the ability to destroy enemies at range or up close. These are the most dramatic aspects of his power, the ones that make for the best stories and the most compelling descriptions. But there is an argument that the most formidable thing about the Emperor of Mankind was never any of those things. It was his mind. Not his psychic mind specifically, though the two are inseparable. His ordinary, analytical, planning, calculating, strategic intelligence. The aspect of him that spent 38,000 years watching humanity and learning everything there was to know about what the species was capable of and where it consistently failed. The aspect that designed the Primarchs to fill specific gaps in the kind of leadership the Great Crusade would need. Each one a calculated answer to a different problem of war and governance and culture. the aspect that ran the Webway project in complete secrecy for years, while simultaneously managing the politics of an interstellar empire and the military demands of an ongoing crusade of conquest. The Emperor was, by any measure, the most intelligent being humanity has ever produced. This is not a statement about raw information processing, though he certainly had that in abundance. It is a statement about the kind of intelligence that operates across long time frames, that can hold multiple incompatible objectives in mind simultaneously and find paths between them, that can look at a chaotic situation and perceive the signal within the noise and understand which variables actually matter. His understanding of genetics was, and remains, unmatched in the setting. The Adeptus Mechanicus, which has spent 10,000 years studying and maintaining the gene seed technology he created, still does not fully understand how he did it. They can follow the procedures. They can maintain what he made. They cannot replicate the original work. The Primarch-level creations, the 20 gene sons he built from his own DNA and psychic essence, remain unique in the history of the setting. Nobody else has made anything comparable, and the attempts to replicate the process have produced varying degrees of disaster. His understanding of the warp, accumulated over nearly 40,000 years of careful observation and controlled interaction, was deeper than that of any being who was not a native entity of the Immaterium. He understood the mechanics of psychic power in ways that most psychers spent their entire lives failing to grasp. He understood the behavior of warp entities, their motivations, their limitations, the specific conditions under which they could and could not manifest. He was also, consistently, a politician, not in the pejorative sense, in the genuine sense of someone who understood that raw power, however overwhelming, is insufficient to build the kind of civilization that could survive the threats he was planning against. He needed to negotiate as well as conquer. He needed to bring people into the project who were not compelled by force. The treaty with Mars is worth dwelling on. He built the imperial truth, the secular rational framework that rejected religion and superstition. And then he signed a treaty with the Adeptus Mechanicus that essentially permitted them to practice their own religion within the Imperium, because getting their manufacturing capacity and technical expertise was more important than maintaining doctrinal purity. He knew what he was doing. He accepted the cost, because the alternative was worse. This kind of decision-making, holding competing principles in tension, and finding the position that sacrifices the least important thing to gain the most important thing, is not the behavior of someone who is simply strong. It is the behavior of someone who is wise. He was not always right, but he was right more often, and more consequentially, than any other individual in the history of the setting. The intelligence that built the Imperium, that designed the Space Marines and the Primarchs and the Astronomicon and the Webway project, is a form of power that does not show up in combat statistics. But it operated continuously, across timescales no human mind except his could span, and it produced things that are still holding the galaxy together 10,000 years after the mind that made them fell silent. Extended section. The perpetual nature. What immortality actually means. The Emperor was what the lore calls a perpetual. This is a specific designation in the Warhammer 40,000 universe for a small category of humans who cannot truly die. Not in the sense of being impossible to kill, in the sense that death is not final for them. They regenerate from mortal wounds. Their souls persist in the warp, even when their bodies are destroyed. A small number of other perpetuals appear in the lore. Olanius Pius, John Grammaticus, Vulcan, one of the Primarchs, who exhibit similar characteristics. Each demonstrates the same pattern. Injuries that should be fatal are survived, recovery occurs, and the underlying consciousness persists. The Emperor was a perpetual from birth. Over tens of thousands of years, this quality accumulated in ways that fundamentally changed what he was. A perpetual who dies once and regenerates is different from a perpetual who has lived for 38,000 years, dying and regenerating possibly many times, accumulating the experience and psychic weight of all those lifetimes simultaneously. The Emperor was not just the version of himself who was born in Neolithic Anatolia. He was the sum of every version of himself that had ever existed, carrying all of it forward. The perpetual quality is also what makes the question of whether he could be reborn from the Golden Throne so complicated. The standard perpetual cycle would suggest that if his physical body finally fails, his soul should persist long enough to reincarnate. But the Golden Throne is not a normal death situation. His body is not dying in the conventional sense. It is being sustained far past the point of natural failure by ancient technology and continuous psychic input. Some characters in the lore speculate that allowing the Emperor to die properly and completely would trigger a rebirth, that a new Emperor, carrying all the accumulated soul weight of the original plus the 10,000 years on the throne plus the faith of hundreds of billions, would emerge somewhere on Terra or in the Warp, more powerful than before. Others believe the risk is too great. That the death of the Emperor, even temporarily, would trigger the collapse of the Astronomicon, the opening of the Webway breach, the end of the Imperium as a functioning entity before the reborn Emperor could do anything to stop it. This is the central dilemma of the current 40,000 timeline, and it is a dilemma that the perpetual nature of the Emperor makes possible. Without that nature, the question would not exist. He would simply be dead. The perpetual quality, in the context of a being who has existed for 48,000 years, is one of the most important aspects of understanding what he is. He is not just powerful, he is an accumulation. He is the product of more lived experience than any other being in the setting has ever possessed, organized and purposeful rather than simply long. Extended section, the Council of Nicaea and the Limits of Foresight. The Council of Nicaea illustrates something crucial about the Emperor's power that raw feats alone cannot capture. His foresight, extraordinary as it was, had genuine limits. The council was convened during the Great Crusade specifically to debate the use of psychers within the Space Marine legions. The question was whether librarians, the psychically gifted Space Marines who served as psychic warriors within their legions, should be permitted to continue practicing their abilities. The counter-argument, made forcefully by Lehman Russ among others, was that psychic ability was inherently dangerous, and that the chaos-aligned lodge organizations infiltrating the legions were using librarian traditions as cover for corruption. The Emperor ruled in favor of restriction. The Edict of Nicaea banned the use of psychic abilities within the Space Marine legions, with narrow exceptions. Magnus the Red, who was at the time the most powerful and most intellectually proud of the psychically gifted Primarchs, was devastated by the ruling. He had built his entire legion around the development and responsible use of psychic ability. The Nicaea ruling felt to him like a condemnation of everything he was. He complied, formally, but he did not change his beliefs. And when the crisis of Horus's corruption came, when he saw in his psychic visions what was happening and needed to warn his father urgently, he fell back on the abilities he had been told not to use, with catastrophic results. Did the Emperor foresee Magnus's betrayal of the Webway project? The lore suggests he saw many possible futures, including ones in which the warning attempt went terribly wrong. But foresight and the ability to prevent what you foresee are not the same thing. Knowing something might happen does not always give you the ability to stop it without creating other problems that are just as bad. This is the tragedy at the heart of the Emperor's story. He was extraordinarily far-sighted. He could see outcomes that no one else could see, but he was not omniscient. He could be surprised. He could be wrong. And the gap between his understanding and perfect understanding was large enough for catastrophe to slip through. What the Nicaea story reveals, at minimum, is that his power had genuine limits. He was not a being who could simply think his way through any problem to a perfect solution. He was doing his best, with extraordinary capabilities and extraordinary constraints, in a universe that was actively trying to undo everything he built. Extended section, the custodian guard, and the measure of what he created. One way to understand the Emperor's power is to look at the things he made and extrapolate backward from the quality of those creations. The Adeptus Custodes, his personal guard, are perhaps the clearest example. They are not Space Marines. They are not Primarchs. They occupy a category between the two, individually more capable than Space Marines and closer to Primarchs in raw personal fighting power, but present in much smaller numbers. Each custodian is personally overseen in their creation by the Emperor himself, or by the highest-ranked members of his inner circle, working from his direct specifications. The process is so complex and so dependent on knowledge that only he possessed that the Imperium in the current era cannot create new custodians at all. They simply maintain the ones that exist. The Space Marine legions are another data point. Each Marine is a remarkable piece of work. The gene seed process, the physical augmentations, the psycho-conditioning, the years of training. And this was derived work, several steps removed from the Emperor's original designs, built from templates of templates and maintained by tech priests who understood portions of the process without understanding the whole. And they are still, by any objective measure, among the most formidable individual warriors in the known galaxy. In a universe with access to advanced alien technology, recovered artifacts from the dark age of technology, and thousands of years of accumulated research, nobody has managed to create a space marine from scratch. The process remains, essentially, the Emperor's alone. The Imperium can maintain what he made. It cannot make more of it at the same quality. And the things he made are still, 10,000 years later, the foundation of how humanity survives. Extended section, comparing scales. The Emperor against the widest frame. To truly understand the Emperor's place in the power structure of the 40,000 universe, it helps to stand back and look at the widest possible frame of reference. The setting contains entities of extraordinary power. The Chaos Gods are the most obvious, genuinely ancient beings of massive psychic presence, whose influence extends across dimensions, and whose domains in the warp are so well established that they function as permanent features of the psychic landscape. Each one has had tens of thousands of years, some potentially millions of years, to accumulate power and presence. Khorne, the god of war, grows stronger with every conflict fought anywhere in the galaxy. Nurgle, the god of entropy, grows stronger with every death and every disease. Tsaench, the god of change, grows stronger with every act of sorcery and every plan made and broken. Slaanesh, the youngest, was born from the collective excess of an entire civilization. Against these, the Emperor is a finite being, a human being, however extraordinary. He does not have an infinite psychic reservoir. He does not regenerate power from the emotions of a million worlds the way the Chaos Gods do. His power is vast by any human measure, vast enough to match Chaos champions empowered by those gods in the material universe, vast enough to burn wounds in their divine territories from across interstellar distances while simultaneously maintaining galaxy-scale infrastructure. But it is not infinite. Here is what remains true across all comparisons. The Emperor is the single most important stabilizing force in the material universe for human civilization. Remove any of the great Chaos Gods from the equation and the setting changes, but the Imperium continues. Remove any of the Necron dynasties and the setting changes, but the Imperium continues. Remove the Emperor. Let the throne fail. Let the Astronomicon go dark and the webway breach open, and the Imperium ends, within days or weeks. Not through enemy action, but through the simple collapse of the infrastructure that holds it together. This is a form of power that has nothing to do with fighting. It is the power of being necessary, of being so deeply embedded in the survival of the civilization you built, that your absence is equivalent to the civilization's death. The Emperor is not just the most powerful individual in the setting. He is the most load-bearing individual in the setting. He is carrying more weight, continuously, than any other single entity, and he has been doing it for 10,000 years without stopping. That is the answer to the question of how powerful he is. He is powerful enough to keep doing the impossible, for an impossible length of time, under impossible conditions. He has not yet stopped. The number matters less than the duration, and the duration is 10,000 years and counting. He is powerful enough to keep going. And in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where everything and everyone eventually fails and falls and is consumed by the darkness, that might be the most impressive feat of all. Extended section. What would a free Emperor look like? The thought experiment that haunts the 40K fandom, and for good reason, is this one. What would the Emperor be able to do if he were no longer confined to the Golden Throne? The question has several layers. First, there is the immediate physical question. His body is 10,000 years past the point of natural death, sustained by technology rather than biology. Even freed from the throne, he would not simply stand up and walk. Some form of reconstruction would be necessary. The lore has danced around this question without answering it, but the implications of his perpetual nature, combined with the psychic energy he has been accumulating over 10 millennia of worship by hundreds of billions of people, suggest that regeneration is not impossible, difficult, unprecedented, requiring resources and knowledge that may or may not be available, but not impossible. Second, There is the question of the twin burdens, the Astronomicon and the Webway seal. If he left the throne, these would need to be maintained by other means, or they would fail. Some in the lore have theorized that a sufficiently powerful replacement could be found for the Astronomicon, perhaps a network of highly capable psychers, rather than a single mind. The Webway breach is harder to solve, being a structural damage that requires the specific kind of psychic anchoring that the Emperor provides. But set those practical challenges aside for a moment and ask the purer question. If the Emperor were somehow restored, freed, and able to act without constraint, what would that look like? The feats he performed from the throne, at his most diminished and most constrained, included reaching across the galaxy to fight a Chaos God's lieutenant and burn a wound in divine territory. That was a fraction of his available power, directed through the body of his son, while simultaneously maintaining two galaxy-scale responsibilities. A free emperor, fully restored, directing the entire weight of 48,000 years of accumulated power and experience and the amplification of 10,000 years of worshippers' faith, would be operating at a level that the setting's current power ceiling does not have adequate language to describe. The Chaos Gods know this. This is why their approach to the Emperor has never been simply to wait for him to die. A dead emperor, a properly dead emperor, might come back as something even more formidable. Their preferred outcome, if they could achieve it, would be for the Golden Throne to sustain him forever, keeping him locked in an endless diminishing existence that never quite ends and never quite recovers. The stasis is what serves them. The uncertainty is what protects them. Whether the story of the 41st millennium is building toward a resolution of that stasis, whether Games Workshop will ever show us what a fully realized Emperor of mankind looks like when the restraints are removed, is something only time will answer. But the setup is there. The pieces are moving. The enemies are afraid. And somewhere on a throne in a dying palace on a holy world, a mind that has been watching and waiting, for longer than recorded history, keeps doing what it has always done, working towards something that nobody else in the galaxy can see yet. Extended section. The theology and its complications. There is one more layer to the Emperor's power that deserves careful attention. The religion built around him. He hated the idea of it while he could say so. The imperial creed, the organized worship of the Emperor as the God Emperor of mankind, is everything he spent his emergence period arguing against. He built the imperial truth specifically to resist the human tendency to worship what was most powerful in the vicinity. He understood correctly that religious devotion to a fallible individual created vulnerability. It made questioning him into heresy. It made acknowledging his mistakes impossible. It made the kind of rational course correction he was counting on for long-term survival much harder to accomplish. And yet, the warp is made of belief. The warp is shaped by the collective emotional and psychic experience of conscious beings. When hundreds of billions of humans, over 10,000 years, direct their most intense feelings of hope and devotion and faith toward a single figure, that direction shapes something in the immaterium. Something real, something measurable, or at least detectable by being sensitive enough to perceive it. The Emperor's presence in the warp has been growing, not diminishing, growing. The entity that was once a single extraordinary human psyker, however powerful, is now also the focus of the largest sustained act of collective belief in the history of the species. These two things are not separate. The human who was born in Anatolia 10,000 years before the Common Era, and the figure worshipped across 1,000,000 worlds in the 41st millennium are connected by a continuity of soul and identity, but they are not the same magnitude of presence in the psychic dimension. This is why the Chaos Gods describe him as the anathema rather than simply as a powerful enemy. They do not fear what he was. They fear what he is becoming. The trajectory of his power, if measured across the 10,000 years since the heresy, has not been a downward slope of decay. It has been something more complicated, a physical body deteriorating while something else grows. Whether that something else is truly divine in the sense the ecclesiarchy claims, whether the entity accumulating in the warp around the Emperor's consciousness is a god in any meaningful sense of that word, is a question the setting has carefully not answered. But the direction of the evidence, the fearful attention of entities who have no reason to be afraid of things that are not genuine threats, suggests that the answer to what he is becoming may be something more significant than what he ever was. He was born as an act of collective will. He is, 10,000 years into his vigil, becoming an act of collective belief. The species that created him in the beginning is creating him again, differently, in ways neither they nor he fully understand. If there is a version of this story where the Emperor rises, where the journey that started in a Neolithic farming village and passed through the 38,000 years of preparation and a great crusade and a civil war and 10,000 years of silent endurance reaches its culmination, what rises would not simply be the man who walked those ancient roads. It would be the sum of everything humanity has poured into his name since then. It would be something that has never existed before in the history of this galaxy. Something that the Chaos Gods, for all their ancient power and all their careful manipulation of this long story, have never had to face. And perhaps that is why they are afraid. Extended section. The Great Crusade in detail, what we actually saw. The feats attributed to the Emperor during the Great Crusade deserve more detailed examination than the broad strokes allow, because the broad strokes give you the shape of the thing, but not the texture of it. And the texture matters if you want to understand what level of power we're actually discussing. The Great Crusade lasted for roughly 200 years, from the late 30th millennium into the early 31st. In that time, the Emperor's forces, under his direct command for much of that period, reunited approximately 1 million human worlds that had been isolated from each other during the Age of Strife. 1 million worlds, each one representing a unique military and political challenge, each one requiring either conquest or diplomacy or some combination of both. Each one added to an administrative structure that was being built in real time, often on the fly, often under conditions of active conflict. The logistical achievement alone, leaving aside the purely military and psychic aspects, is staggering. Coordinating 20 Space Marine legions, each numbering in the tens of thousands of warriors, across an active front that covered thousands of light years in every direction, requires a command structure of extraordinary sophistication and an individual at the top of that structure, with the ability to process information and make decisions faster than any conventional communication system could support. The Emperor was that individual. He maintained strategic oversight of the entire crusade from his flagship and, later from Terra after handing nominal command to Horus, in ways that went beyond what normal intelligence or conventional communication could explain. He was perceiving the state of the front not just through the reports his staff compiled, but through his psychic awareness, his ability to read the currents of the warp and understand what they were reflecting about events in the material universe across the entire breadth of the campaign. During the period when he was personally leading from the front, he was present at the most critical junctures. When a particular world or a particular enemy proved resistant to the forces already committed, the Emperor would arrive. His personal presence was not just a morale factor, though it was certainly that. It was a practical intervention. He brought capabilities to those situations that could not be replicated by any other asset available to the Crusade. There is a specific class of enemy that appears in multiple accounts of the Great Crusade that is worth discussing. The warp-touched threats. Worlds that had spent the Age of Strife in contact with the warp, either deliberately or accidentally, and that had produced entities or environments that conventional Space Marine tactics could not adequately address. Chaos cults that had been building power for centuries. Demon-touched warlords who had made bargains that made them effectively immune to ordinary weapons. Worlds where the boundary between reality and the warp had thinned to the point that fighting in them meant fighting by rules that no standard training program had prepared for. Against these, the Emperor's psychic ability was not supplementary. It was necessary. He could perceive the warp taint within an enemy in ways that his commanders could not. He could identify which threats were genuinely dangerous and which were theatrical displays that could be pushed through. He could reach into the psychic infrastructure of a cult's power and dismantle it at the source rather than fighting its manifestations indefinitely. He also fought Xenos threats personally during this period that went far beyond what any conventional warrior could handle. The orcs encountered during the Crusade, those massive and violent organisms whose collective psychic presence creates a resonance field that makes their belief in their own invincibility partially real, were not straightforwardly defeatable by force alone in every case. Their largest and most powerful leaders had accumulated so much of that collective psychic resonance that they were genuinely formidable opponents for anyone short of a Primarch. The Emperor treated them as manageable problems. His most celebrated campaign during this period was probably the Ulanor Crusade, the massive coordinated operation against the largest orc empire yet encountered, a galactic-scale horde led by a creature called the Overlord Urlok-Urg. The Overlord was not simply the most physically powerful orc that campaign had yet produced. It was the focal point for a collective psychic power field generated by the largest single gathering of the orc species yet encountered. Killing it was a task that required not just physical capability, but the ability to fight through the psychic resonance that made it almost supernaturally resilient. The Emperor killed it, personally, in front of his Primarchs and his legions, demonstrating what the apex of human potential looked like when it finally had a worthy opponent. The scale of the celebration that followed, the triumph on Ulanor that led to Horus being named War Master, was proportional to the scale of what had just been accomplished. This was not just a military victory, it was a demonstration, and that is a word worth sitting with. Demonstration. A significant portion of the Emperor's actions during the Great Crusade were, deliberately or not, demonstrations of what humanity was capable of when organized and led properly, of what was possible when psychic ability was developed with discipline and purpose rather than allowed to run wild, of what the species could achieve if it stopped fighting itself and directed that energy outward. He was showing his people what they could be. And for the duration of the Great Crusade, for those 200 years of expansion and contact and hard-won unity, it seemed like the demonstration was working. Extended section, the silent 10,000. What the vigil cost. 10,000 years is a number that comes up constantly in discussions of the Emperor's time on the throne, and it should because that is a genuinely extraordinary span of time. But I think we often process it as a large, abstract number, rather than as the lived reality it represents. Think about what 10,000 years of continuous existence, without movement, without speech, without sleep as biological beings understand sleep, confined to a single device, sustained by the deaths of 1,000 people per day, every single one of those days actually means. The total number of psychers sacrificed to sustain the Emperor across 10,000 years of 1,000 per day is 365 million people. An entire large city's worth of human beings, psychically gifted individuals gathered from across the galaxy, sacrificed every single year, continuously, for 100 centuries. This is the most horrifying accounting in the entire setting, and it is presented not as an atrocity by the Imperium, but as a cost of survival, as the price of the light that holds the darkness back. And the Emperor, if he is conscious enough to perceive any of this, has been experiencing it for 10,000 years. Each soul fed into the machinery of the throne is, in some sense, passing through him. His psychic presence in that mechanism means that the death of each sacrifice is not merely a technical input to the system, it is a contact. A consumption that he did not choose in a situation he did not design, for a purpose that was never meant to be permanent. The human being who walked through the ancient world, who spent 38,000 years trying to guide his species towards something better, who hated the idea of being worshipped, and hated the idea of human life being treated as a resource, is now the center of a system that sacrifices 365 million people every century. Whether he is aware enough to feel the weight of this is one of the questions that makes his existence genuinely tragic rather than simply impressive. The lore hints at both possibilities. Some accounts suggest his consciousness has expanded so far beyond its original human form that individual deaths are below the resolution of his current perception, that he processes them the way a planet processes individual atoms of atmosphere. Others suggest that some core awareness remains, some fragment of the being who walked in white and crimson before the Albion clan lords and spoke of his vision for humanity, and that this fragment experiences everything the throne requires as an endless and inescapable cost. The custodians who guard him, who have been at their posts for 10,000 years, maintaining their vigil in the same silence that he maintains his, are perhaps the only beings in the setting capable of any first-hand knowledge of what the throne takes from him. They speak of it rarely and obliquely. Their accounts are fragments, but across those fragments there is a consistent quality that might be described as reverence shot through with grief. What they are guarding is not just the most important functional asset of the Imperium, it is also the most profound act of endurance in the history of a species that has produced extraordinary acts of endurance. He chose this. In the moment on the Vengeful Spirit, when he could have chosen to let go, to die finally and completely, and trust whatever came next to be sufficient, He chose instead to let himself be placed on the throne and continue, with full awareness of what that meant. He has been choosing to continue every day for 10,000 years. The cost of that choice is the sacrifice of 365 million people per century. The cost of that choice is 10,000 years of immobility. The cost of that choice is the decay of the Imperium into the theocratic nightmare that operates in his name, the exact kind of superstitious religious state he spent his emergence period arguing against. And yet, without that choice, the Astronomicon goes dark, and billions of ships are lost in the warp within years. Without that choice, the webway breach opens, and Terra is consumed by demons. Without that choice, the Chaos Gods win, in the immediate and practical sense of winning, within decades of his death. He knew all of this. He made the calculation and accepted the cost. This is his power, finally and most truly, not the psychic output, not the physical capability, not the strategic genius, the willingness to pay a cost that no other being in the setting was positioned to pay, and to keep paying it, day after day, for 10,000 years, because the alternative was worse. That is what the Emperor of Mankind was. That is what he is. A being of extraordinary power who uses that power in the service of a purpose that is larger than himself, even when the cost of that service is everything, even when the cost never stops. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but at the exact center of that darkness, there is something that has not given up, has not stopped, has not accepted the darkness as the final word. 10,000 years of silence is not the same as 10,000 years of absence. And whatever the Emperor is building toward, from that silent throne in that dying palace, it is not finished yet. Extended section. The Unification Wars in detail. The first show of force. When the Emperor stepped out of the shadows in the late 29th millennium, he did not announce himself with a quiet diplomatic communique. He came with armies. Specifically, he came with the Thunder Warriors, his first generation of genetically engineered super soldiers, each one the product of alchemical augmentation and gene sculpting techniques that the broader world of Terra had no idea were even possible. The Unification Wars lasted from approximately 800 to 712 of the 30th millennium. That is roughly a century of continuous warfare across a single planet. A century might sound like a long time for a war on one world, but Terra at the end of the Age of Strife was not an ordinary world in an ordinary time. It had been fractured for thousands of years. Every surviving faction had been militarizing continuously, building weapons and defenses appropriate for a world where the next attack could come from any direction at any time. Some of these factions had access to recovered technology from the Dark Age of technology, pre-collapse artifacts of extraordinary power that gave them capabilities far beyond what the 30th millennium had managed to redevelop. The Emperor fought through all of it. Campaign by campaign, faction by faction, he built the unified world he needed as the launch platform for the Great Crusade that followed. Some of his campaigns involved overwhelming force, the Thunder Warriors and their supporting armies simply outmatching opposition that could not compete at the same level of genetic enhancement and tactical coordination. Some involved the kind of psychic intervention that no other warlord on Terra could match. The Emperor personally dismantling the supernatural defenses that certain factions had constructed from whatever warp-touched power was available to them in the Age of Strife. The Maul and Sen Confederacy, which had built its power base on dark rituals and human sacrifice, found that the psychic constructs they had assembled over generations were not adequate protection against something that could perceive their structure from across a battlefield and begin unraveling them before the physical forces even closed to engagement range. Their rituals were real. Their power was genuine. It was simply not in the same category as the being they were fighting. He also, crucially, did not always fight. The Albion clans were offered terms. The Achaemenid Empire submitted early and was preserved. Throughout the Unification Wars, there runs a consistent pattern of the Emperor offering alternatives to destruction for enemies who had the wisdom to take them. He was not fighting for the pleasure of fighting. He was building a specific structure, and the structure required people, as well as territory. A Terra depopulated by total war would not be an adequate foundation for what came next. This is the Emperor's intelligence at work in the most practical sense. He was fighting and diplomating simultaneously, maintaining the distinction between enemies that needed to be defeated and enemies that needed to be brought in. The people who chose to oppose him were given every opportunity to change their choice. The ones who did not were dealt with in the way that the survival of the project required. The Thunder Warriors themselves were extraordinary in their moment. They were larger and stronger and more resilient than ordinary humans by margins that made conventional soldiers almost irrelevant on the same battlefield. A squad of Thunder Warriors engaging a fortified position that would have required a company of normal soldiers was not an unusual occurrence. They broke the military power of the Terran factions in a way that ordinary armies simply could not have done in the time frame the Emperor was working with. And then, when Terra was unified and their purpose was complete, the Emperor had them killed, because they were unstable, genetically speaking. Because the augmentation techniques that created them were rough early work, sufficient for the task they were built for, but not safe for long-term continuation. Because their existence as a category of being that was post-human, but not part of whatever future the Emperor was building, was a vulnerability that could not be left unaddressed. The cold clarity of that decision, the willingness to terminate a tool that had served well and faithfully because keeping it was a liability rather than an asset, says something important about the Emperor. Not something comfortable, something true. He was, in certain moments, a being who made decisions by calculation rather than by sentiment, who could see the long-term cost of short-term mercy and choose accordingly. The custodians who served as the instrument of the Thunder Warriors' end were apparently troubled by what they were asked to do. Some accounts in the lore suggested the operation was not clean, that some Thunder Warriors survived longer than planned and had to be hunted. The Emperor knew this would be the case and arranged it anyway, because the alternative, a generation of unstable super soldiers existing without purpose in an imperium being built on specific foundations, was worse. This aspect of the Emperor, the cold calculus underlying the grand vision, is part of what makes him a genuinely complex figure rather than a simple hero. He did terrible things for reasons he believed were good, and he was right often enough that the terrible things can be argued to have been worth the cost, but never so definitively right that the argument is settled. He was, and is, a figure who demands to be held to account for what he did, even as the scale and purpose of what he was trying to do is acknowledged. The Warhammer 40,000 setting asks you to do both simultaneously, and the Emperor is the clearest example of why that double accounting matters. He was also, in the end, proof that the species he was trying to save had produced at least one being worthy of the task. That humanity, in its messy and violent and self-destructive history, had generated through its shamans and its suffering and its slow psychic awakening a guardian adequate to the scale of what was coming. Whether that guardian's methods were always right, whether the cost was always worth the outcome, whether the Imperium he built is something to celebrate or to mourn, are questions the setting leaves open. But the fact of him, the raw fact of a being who has existed for 48,000 years, who has carried the weight of an entire species' survival on the force of his own will, who has not stopped and has not given up, and has not accepted defeat even in the most constrained and diminished and terrible circumstances imaginable. That fact stands outside the argument about his methods and his choices. It stands as one of the most extraordinary things in the entire rich and strange history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. He was born as an act of sacrifice. He has lived as an act of will. Whatever he yet becomes will be shaped by the same force that has defined every version of him across 48,000 years of existence. The refusal to stop, the insistence that the work is not yet done, the quiet, terrible certainty that the darkness is not the last word, as long as there is still something at the center of it that has not gone out. That is the Emperor. That is his power. And 10,000 years of silence has not diminished it.